same mistake, but with factors reversed, was committed by the theoretical political party, which has its origins in philosophy. This party saw in the present struggle only the critical struggle of philosophy with the German world, and failed to realize that previous philosophy itself belongs to this world, and its complement, even though an ideal complement. It was critical towards its counterpart, but not towards itself, for it took the presuppositions of philosophy as its point of departure, and either took for granted the conclusions of that philosophy, or passed off demands and conclusions drawn from other quarters as direct philosophical demands and conclusions. But this is to ignore the fact that such demands and conclusions, assuming that they are legitimate, can be achieved only through the negation of previous philosophy, i.e., philosophy as philosophy. We shall save for later a more detailed account of this party. Its basic defect can be summed up as follows. It believed that it could realize philosophy without transcending it. The criticism of the German philosophy of the state and of law, which received its most consistent, thorough, and complete formulation from Hegel, is both these things. It is at once a critical analysis of the modern state, and of the reality connected with it, and a decisive negation of all previous forms of political and juridical consciousness in Germany, whose most refined and universal expression, elevated to the level of a science, is precisely the speculative philosophy of law. Only Germany could develop the speculative philosophy of law, this abstract and high-flown thought of the modern state, the reality of which remains part of another world, even if this other world is only the other side of the Rhine. Conversely, the German conception of the modern state, which abstracts from real man, was only possible because, and insofar as the modern state abstracts from real man, or satisfies the whole man in a purely imaginary way. The Germans have thought in politics what other nations have done. Germany has been their theoretical conscience. The abstraction and arrogance of Germany's thought always kept pace with the one-sided and stunted character of their reality. So if the abstract and arrogance of Germany's thought always kept pace with the one-sided and stunted character of their reality. But if the status quo of the German political system is an expression of the consummation of the ancien regime, the completion of the thorn is the flesh of the modern state. Then the status quo of German political thought is an expression of the imperfection of the modern state, the damaged condition of the flesh itself. As the determined opponent of the previous form of German political consciousness, the criticism of the speculative philosophy of law finds its progression not within itself, but in tasks, which can only be solved in one way, through practice. We must then ask ourselves, can Germany attain a practice a la hauteur de principes, that is to say, a revolution that raises it not only to the official level of modern nations, but to the human level that will be their immediate future? Clearly, the weapon of criticism cannot replace the criticism of weapons, and the material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force, once it has gripped the masses. Theory is capable of gripping the masses when it demonstrates ad hominem, and it demonstrates ad hominem as soon as it becomes radical. To be radical is to grasp things by the root, but for man, the root is man itself. To be radical is to grasp things by the root, but for man, the root is man itself. To be radical is to grasp things by the root, but for man, the root is man himself. Clear proof of the radicalism of German theory and its practical energy is the fact that it takes as its point of departure a decisive and positive transcendence of religion. The criticism of religion ends with the doctrine that for man the supreme being is man, and thus with the categorical imperative to overthrow all conditions in which man is a debased, enslaved, neglected, and contemptible being, conditions that are best described in the exclamation of a Frenchman on the occasion of a proposed tax on dogs. Poor dogs! They want to treat you like human beings. For Germany, theoretical emancipation has a specific practical significance, even from a historical point of view. For Germany's revolutionary past, in the form of the Reformation, is also theoretical. Just as it was then the monk, it is now the philosopher in whose brain the revolution begins. Luther certainly conquered servitude based on devotion, but only by replacing it with servitude based on conviction. He destroyed faith and authority, but only by restoring the authority of faith. He transformed the priests into laymen, but only by transforming the laymen into priests. He freed mankind from external religiosity, but only by making religiosity the inner man. He freed the body from its chains, but only by putting the heart in chains. But even if Protestantism was not the true solution, it did pose the problem correctly. It was now no longer a question of the struggle of the layman with the priest outside himself, but rather of his struggle with his own inner priest, with his priestly nature. And if the Protestant transformation of the German laymen into priests emancipated the lay priests, the princes together with their clergy, the privileged and the Philistines, the philosophical transformation of the priestly Germans into men will emancipate the people. But just as emancipation did not stop with the princes, so will secularization of property not stop with the dispossession of the churches, which was set going above all by hypocritical Prussia. At that time, the Peasants' War, the most radical episode in German history, suffered defeat because of theology. Today, when theology itself has failed, the most unfree episode in German history, our status quo will founder on philosophy. On the eve of the Reformation, official Germany was Rome's most unquestioning vassal. On the eve of its revolution, Germany and the unquestioning vassal of lesser powers. On the eve of its revolution, Germany is the unquestioning vassal of lesser powers than Rome, of Prussia and Austria, of clod-hopping squires and Philistines. But a major difficulty appears to stand in the way of a radical German revolution. The point is that revolutions need a passive element, a material basis. Theory is realized in a people only insofar as it is a realization of the people's needs. But will the enormous gap that exists between the demands of German thought and the responses of German reality now correspond to the same gap between civil society and the state and civil society itself? Will theoretical needs be directly practical needs? It is not enough that thought should strive to realize itself. Reality must itself strive towards thought. But Germany did not pass through the immediate stages of political emancipation at the same time as modern nations. Even the stages that is left behind in history, it has not yet reached in practice. How is Germany, in its salta mortale, to override not only its limitations, but also those of the modern nations? To override limitations, in point of fact, is sought to experience. How is Germany, in one salto mortale, to override not only its limitations, but also those of the modern nations? To override limitations, which in point of fact it ought to experience and strive for, is liberation from its real limitations. A radical revolution can only be the revolution of radical needs, but the preconditions and seedbeds for such needs appear to be lacking. Yet, even if Germany has only kept company with the development of the modern nations through the abstract activity of thought, without taking an active part in the real struggles of this development, it has nevertheless shared in the sufferings of its development, without sharing in its pleasures and its partial satisfaction. Abstract activity, on the one hand, corresponds to abstract suffering on the other. Germany will therefore one day find itself at the level of European decadence, before it has ever reached the level of European emancipation. It will be like a fetish worshipper suffering from the diseases of Christianity. If we examine the German governments, we find that as a result of the circumstances of the time, the situation in Germany, the standpoint of German education, and finally their own happy instincts, they are driven to combine the civilized defects of the modern political world, whose advantages we lack, with the barbaric defects of the ancien regime, of which we have our full measure. In this way, Germany must participate more and more, if not for the reason, that at least in the unreason, even of those state forms which have progressed beyond its status quo. For example, is there any history? For example, is there any country in the world which shares as naively as so-called constitutional Germany all the illusions of the constitutional state, without sharing any of their realities? Or is it just an accident that the idea of combining the torments of censorship with the torments of the French September laws It's more than 12 minutes.